Yeah, thank you so much for the great introduction, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak at this webinar today. It's very exciting for me, particularly as sort of a clinician who is doing research in this area, to be speaking to an audience who is hopefully engaged and very interested in this idea of trial methodology. So, as someone mentioned, I will be talking today about our own approaches to improving clinical trials through applying implementation science. And I think that this is a great opportunity for us to really add on to a lot of the things that people are doing to improve clinical trials around the world and kind of put a different lens on things and apply some of the research that we've done in implementation science for other evidence-based practices and adapting them to clinical trials. And so in terms of implementation science and context today, we're going to be talking about applying context and adding perspective to a lot of different things. There's a refrain in implementation science that context is king. And we'll be talking later about how this applies and influences our approach trying to get people to do evidence-based things like clinical trials better or more. But I also think even for things like receiving talks or discussing different people's approaches to science, it can be really helpful to understand their personal context and what perspectives they're bringing that will be flavoring their approach in the way that they speak and perceive things. And so for me, I'm a urologic oncologist, as mentioned, at the University of Michigan in the United States, which is here in this beautiful maize and blue mitten. And my clinical practice is mostly cancer surgery. So that's where I spend about half my time. And when I am not doing surgery, my research interests and training include health services research, implementation science, as mentioned, and then this clinical trials methodology, which I know you all are interested in. And so we're talking about clinical trials today. The reason I bring this up is primarily to explain that sort of my baseline or default approach for clinical trials is going to be heavily flavored by my experience as a clinician and as an oncologist specifically. So when I think of a clinical trial and when most of my colleagues will think of a clinical trial, we're going to be defaulting to a cancer drug trial. And when I think of how to better design and implement clinical trials, because I'm based in the United States and specifically in Michigan, my default and what I'm most familiar with is going to be the United States healthcare context and the university healthcare context, which is sort of a system within a system in the United States that's very complex. So while this doesn't preclude me from considering other clinical trials or other contexts, other settings around the world, or even in other areas of the country, it does mean that my perspective is going to be heavily flavored and influenced by that. And I think that can be helpful to understand that sort of a slant up front for where people are coming from. Another important thing, particularly in the United States, is understanding other conflicts of interest. I personally have no financial conflicts of interest, but I do receive research funding from the United States National Institutes of Health and National Cancer Institute. So in terms of an outline for what we're going to talk about today, after our introduction, I'm going to pitch this idea of clinical trials as a complex evidence-based practice. And we'll talk about what that means in the context of implementation science specifically, as well as some of the benefits of clinical trials, which hopefully you're familiar with. But we're also going to talk about some of the tribulations of trials and really how we have a struggle with trial conduct, particularly in the cancer clinical trial space, but also extending to all clinical trials across the board. We'll then give a very brief introduction to implementation science, including the making implementation science almost too simple, and then how we're proposing applying these implementation science frameworks and really the whole implementation science approach to clinical trials. Again, trying to improve the conduct, efficiency, and ultimately the equity of how our clinical trials run. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about next steps in clinical trials implementation science. Sort of a side goal or meta goal of this is to encourage discussion and hopefully collaboration with folks around the world on how we can work together to make all of our clinical trials run more smoothly and start to establish a better common vocabulary that's going to be well understood by all stakeholders across the clinical trial spectrum, including researchers, methodologists, and then the clinicians, providers, and patients who are all participating in this global clinical trials enterprise. And I'd like to start by saying that we're going to be talking a lot about clinical trials today, as you all know. And I want to recognize and highlight that clinical trials are a huge amount of work, as you all know. And I want to offer a ton of appreciation and support, as well as respect to anyone who's involved in a clinical trial. As we'll get into, I think trials are super important for multiple reasons, and working to advance the cause of clinical trials itself is critically important. So I want to give a big thanks to everyone who's involved. And with a lot of this in mind, a lot of the terminology we'll be talking about today about clinical trial improvement, including some of the terms that I use today, could be seen to have a negative connotation. So I want to emphasize right from the get-go that the aim of using words and concepts like trial failure is not an indictment of the efforts of those who are involved in clinical trials, but it's meant to spur improvement in clinical trials. Just like we're constantly looking to improve our clinical care of patients, we also can talk about failure in the context of looking for improvement as opposed to pointing fingers. I think there's a lot of possibility from various groups, including clinicians, methodologists, and other researchers, as I mentioned, to leverage the same energy that we're using to improve clinical care to improve the clinical trial quality and conduct as well. So all that being said, I want to move into this idea of pitching clinical trials as evidence-based practice. And how I pitch this to people who are not already in the clinical trial methodology space is sort of why you should care about the importance of clinical trial improvement. So even if folks are not designing or running trials themselves, people are affected by the results and the conduct of trials. As we know, trials advance science, they lead to new treatments, they benefit patients, and they're really sort of the gatekeeper to approval and establishment of evidence for treatments. But there are direct benefits to patients and participants in clinical trials that can be regardless of which arm you're on in a clinical trial. So just participating in a trial in some instances can be the best possible management for a patient. And in some settings, including in cancer, trial participation could even be considered the standard of care because of these benefits to people who are enrolling. As an oncologist, as I mentioned, we turn to the National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines, or NCCN guidelines, for our management of patients, or guidelines on our management of patients. And their belief is that the benefit of clinical trials is so great that the best management for any patient with cancer can be considered enrollment in a clinical trial. And in all of their clinical guideline statements, they encourage participation in clinical trials. So we really can consider that these benefits are so vast and participation in clinical trials can be considered an evidence-based standard of care. But on top of this, there's benefits and large considerations of not just why trials themselves can be good for patients and society, but also benefits to improving the way that we run our trials. So if you aren't sold on trial improvement just because of the benefits to patients, society, et cetera, trials are a huge source of both costs and revenue. There's just a straight financial argument for improving trial conduct, as trials are such a huge source of both cost and revenue. There are estimates ranging from $50 billion a year to $200 billion a year invested in clinical trials worldwide, with a significant portion of that going specifically to cancer clinical trials and specifically cancer drug trials. And there are, addition to this, millions of dollars that are not recorded in this that are given by individual centers that are invested just in supporting the way that we do trials, on top of the whole grant sphere and other things that are investing in this. And there's an additional cost and potential revenue that comes from individual patients or participants who are enrolled in trials. So for many drug trials, there can be $4,000 to $20,000 US that are generated per patient who are enrolled on a trial, on top of all of the other investments that are put financially into these trials. So taken together, there are vast benefits to clinical trials, both from the results of the trials, participation in the trials themselves. There are vast investments of time, energy, and money in trials. And so they're really inherently an evidence-based practice that is a good thing. But they're not free of tribulations. Despite all of these great benefits, there are some really big issues facing clinical trials that we've all faced in our work with trials before. One of the biggest issues we've identified in some of our prior work is that, at least for cancer clinical trials, there's a fairly high rate of failure, meaning trials that are not reaching their primary endpoint. We've previously estimated in some of our work that about 1 in 5 cancer clinical trials fails for a non-informative reason, meaning ending before reaching its primary endpoint for a reason unrelated to toxicity or efficacy. And most of the time we found that this is because of low enrollment. And unfortunately, thousands of patients are still enrolled onto clinical trials that ultimately fail, meaning they're going to be entirely non-informative. And this is a huge problem, not just for the trials themselves, but also because when we are enrolling a patient onto a clinical trial, we're making a promise to them that their enrollment will help advance science and help patients who come after them. And if we're not doing everything we can to try to improve the conduct of trials and try to get more trials across that finish line, then we're breaking that promise and that sort of contract that we're making with patients when we talk about trials to begin with. And this problem with enrollment doesn't just contribute to trial failure. This idea of trial enrollment being low and slow is fairly pervasive. It is the most common reason for trials to fail overall. But even when trials do complete, trial enrollment has remained low and slow for years. In the cancer space, only about 2 to 8% of eligible cancer patients will enroll on trials. And again, as we mentioned before, if a cancer clinical trial is the standard of care for a patient with cancer, that suggests a majority of patients may not be receiving the best possible care for their cancer. On top of this, if enrollment is so low and so slow, many trials are not completing their enrollment within the planned time frame. And what this means is that trial results are delayed, and so the best possible management can't be decided until later than it could be. And also that trial expenses, as mentioned, are ballooning. The other thing this can lead to is potentially underpowered trials. These problems with enrollment can extend to trials themselves, even when they're considered completed, as they may not ultimately reach their enrollment goals. We've previously looked at this within urologic oncology trials. We found that half of all trials failed to meet about 85% of their goal enrollment, which is considered sufficient enrollment by prior literature. And even a third of completed trials failed to meet 85% of their goal enrollment. And this sort of makes me think two things. Either one, these trials are insufficiently powered, or two, we're doing a terrible job of estimating how many patients we're going to need to adequately power and answer the trial question. And so summing up so far, we understand that trials have huge benefits, and they can be considered an evidence-based practice. Unfortunately, trial enrollment has remained low, perhaps reflecting poor implementation. And so rephrasing this is saying that clinical trials are complex, evidence-based practices that are often suffering from poor implementation. And what this brings up is this idea of we have something that we know is good, but it's not being used as much in the real world as it should be. And that's describing an evidence to practice gap, which leads us into the science of implementation. And so there's this gap in both sort of a nuance and definition of clinical trial gaps between what we know is good and what is actually being done in the real world. And so it seems that we can apply implementation science to this. And I am in implementation science by training, or at least a budding implementation science by training. And so my approach to implementation science is still developing, and we're applying this to clinical trials in a specific way. But in general, implementation science is how do we get people to do good things more and do those good things better? And so the question framing clinical trials in this way is, if clinical trials are so good, why aren't more people enrolling? And then how do we close this evidence to practice gap? In the abstract, this can make sense, but I think it's helpful, particularly for those new to implementation science, to think about other things we can apply implementation science to. So recently, I've used this example a lot, but specifically with the COVID pandemic sort of on the heels now, but we knew that vaccines for COVID were exceptionally efficacious in clinical trials. But they didn't work as well in the real world as we thought they would, primarily because there was suboptimal uptake of vaccines, at least in the United States. And so the problem here is that there's poor implementation of an evidence-based intervention. So we have something that worked in a clinical trial, but we couldn't get it to go in the real world. And so ultimately, the real world impact is this problem of this efficacy that we saw in trials, and then how well it's implemented within the real world. Another way to think about this, which is a great way from an article by Curran et al., was there's this idea of implementation science made too easy. So there's the ultimate goal of increasing, improving real world use of things. In this case, how well we have patients enrolled in clinical trials. We try to figure out and measure how well we're doing those things, and then developing targeted strategies to improve how we do those things. Part of this is going to be necessitating evaluating context so we can adapt and target strategies to get those things done better. And essentially another way to look at this is we're doing problem solving with scientific frameworks. So we're going to be applying this today into the clinical trials context. We have clinical trials that are extremely beneficial, but how do we get people to actually enroll in them better? And how do we get that to work across multiple contexts? Things are going to be different here than they are in Ireland. They're going to be different in other parts of the United States, all over the place. How can we adapt things to work and target strategies to work across all those different settings to get more people appropriately enrolled in clinical trials? So again, this question is how do we improve enrollment? And you may be thinking, oh, if this is such a big problem, why have we not addressed it before? What is the existing literature and research on this? There's a great Cochrane review from a couple of years ago on strategies to improve recruitment to clinical trials. Unfortunately, there are few reproducible studies of enrollment improvement, and only 3 out of the 72 studies highlighted in this review had high-grade evidence. And one of the issues with this for particularly applying to cancer clinical trials is some of the recommendations for the things that worked wouldn't necessarily apply to what I need to do for a randomized clinical trial. For example, having an open label trial was highly effective in increasing enrollment, but if I need to do a blinded placebo-controlled trial, it's not going to help me because it's going to be changing the inherent type of trial we're doing. Part of the problem with this may be if we try something and it works, will it work everywhere? We don't know because we need to establish context. The other issue is that there is a real lack of a structured approach. There are some ideas about how to test different interventions, but how to select which interventions to test, how to sort of have a checklist or a toolkit for how to do this is really lacking. And we've argued that having a structured approach to improving enrollment, perhaps by applying implementation science methods, could help us figure out what's wrong with trials and then structure an approach around it. The remainder of our talk today is going to be talking about what we've done to try to structure this implementation science approach to improve assessing context for trials, identifying barriers, and then measuring the outcomes and developing strategies for it. And so another way to frame this implementation science approach is figuring out what our problem is. In our case, enrollment to clinical trials. We try to identify a root cause, figure out how to measure how well we are doing it or not, map that back to barriers, so what's keeping us from doing things well, and then identifying strategies to overcome these barriers, which again is just a structuring sort of problem-solving approach. And for each of these levels, there is a corresponding implementation science framework. So there's a trial side outcome we framed, which is the problem, cause of the outcome is the root cause. And then today what we'll talk about is implementation outcomes, determinant frameworks, or here the CFR domain, and then implementation strategies that are specifically targeted to this. So rather than walk through each of these adapted constructs off the bat, I'd like to give this as a really concrete example of addressing problem solving for a clinical trial. So we talked about having poor enrollment being really the big issue for why clinical trials are not succeeding, or a big problem with clinical trials. But if you know anything about enrollment, you know that there can be many, many causes for poor enrollment. For example, if I am trying to enroll to a prostate cancer clinical trial, it could be that in my area, there aren't a lot of prostate cancer cases. On the flip side, there could be lots of prostate cancer cases, but the providers I have in my clinic are way too busy in order to offer this clinical trial to patients. We can link this back to implementation frameworks we're going to talk about in a little bit. But for example, low local disease prevalence means that a trial may not be feasible because I just don't have enough prostate cancer cases around. This is an issue of an outer setting, so it's something that I would not be able to fix within my own institution. And a great targeted strategy to try to improve enrollment based on this would be to add more clinical trial sites. A major advantage of laying this out in this structured problem-solving way, or this implementation logic model, is that I can specifically tack back this cause of my poor enrollment, the low local disease prevalence, over to my targeted strategy, which is to add more trial sites. Now, if instead my problem really was that providers are too busy for trials, this is an issue with trial adoption, meaning my providers are not offering the trial. This is an issue in inner setting, and this is something within my own institution that I could potentially address. And maybe something that would work here would be hiring more research staff. Now, this model can also highlight why some of the prior trial improvement interventions might not work, or they might not work in certain contexts. So if, for example, the issue really is that my providers are too busy for trials, hiring more research staff is going to be great. But if the problem is actually that my disease prevalence is low, so for example, if I have only 10 prostate cancer patients a year who are being seen in my clinic, there is no amount of research staff I can possibly hire that's going to allow me to recruit 100 patients per year out of my trial. So if the problem here is that I've hired more research staff and I find it's not effective at all, it may be because there's a low local disease prevalence, not because that intervention does not work. So these are some pretty simple examples, but there are a lot of nuanced situations where trial improvement interventions could be designed in a really targeted way. And we'll talk a little bit later about how we're applying this model to actual trials here at the University of Michigan to try to identify areas for improvement and started to design some interventions that could work here a little bit better. But now I want to take a deeper dive into the science of trials implementation science. I sort of gave the overview here, but I wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive, and hopefully this is of interest to you to be seeing how we can frame some of these implementation science frameworks to try to establish that toolkit to say, how can we better assess some of the context around trials? How do we measure how well our trials are working? And how are we going to measure and improve on those trials? Even within studies within a trial, which are extremely interesting. And I think we can work on a lot with some of this implementation science language. So as I mentioned, implementation science is trying to improve the delivery of evidence-based care and really assess context so tailored interventions can be designed. As I hinted at with my model before, we use three main things to assess and then tailor. First is a determinant framework, which can also be referred to as identifying barriers and facilitators. This is a way to assess context so we figure out what works for who, when, and why. Then there are implementation outcome frameworks, which we'll talk about applying to clinical trials to measure how well we're doing things, specifically the implementation of things in order to overcome those barriers. And then tacking this all to implementation strategies to overcome the barriers that we identified in the determinants. So again, this determinant framework is really looking at how to decide what works where. And this is important for context assessment specifically. Within all evidence-based practices, but particularly important for clinical trials, is that there are really multiple levels of context. So you have the patients who are enrolling or the participants who are enrolling on trials, of course, but then you have the provider or the group, the physicians or whoever who are enrolling patients onto the trial, who are within a practice or an organization which has its own policies that then sit within either your local market or your local government, state government, national and international policy. All of these factors are going to influence what works and what you can and deliver to patients, and you have to work within those contexts. There's some aspects of this which are obvious. And so you may say, why do you need a formal framework to check off of all these things? But there are some things that can also be extremely subtle. And if you didn't deliberately go about assessing this, there are things that you can, of course, miss or not know necessarily how to address. This question here is, how can we structure context assessment? We really want to look for barriers and facilitators of successful implementation, which are also known as determinants. So within the trials context, question here for our issue of clinical trial enrollment is, what is helping or hurting trial enrollment? And we used a determinant framework, such as the consolidated framework for implementation research, in order to apply to this. This is a compendium of multiple constructs and then domains that help us structure this approach to context assessment. There are a few others that are popular, including theoretical domains framework, the tailored implementation in chronic disease, that you can also use to assess these determinants. But what we have structured is this CFR, or consolidated framework for implementation research. Again, this is a framework for identifying determinants, also known as barriers and facilitators, has 5 domains containing 37 constructs, and it's used extensively in implementation research. One of the reasons that we decided to use this for trying to improve or assess the context of clinical trials to ultimately try to improve them through different strategies is that it has these key links to other implementation science frameworks. So rather than creating an entirely new approach to clinical trial improvement, we're trying to nest a lot of these strategies within existing science so we can link back into behavior change literature and the implementation science literature. And so what we did in some of our prior work was adapting this consolidated framework for implementation research specifically to trials. As I mentioned, there are 5 main constructs in the CFIR, which are intervention characteristics, outer setting, which is going to be things at more like a national level or a larger organizational level, inner setting, which is going to be like the hospital or the academic setting that you're in, characteristics of individuals, which can be things like the providers or the patients who are participating, and then process, which is of course how you go about running your clinical trial in this instance. So I thought we'd run through some of these constructs initially and go through how we've proposed adapting these clinical trials. For intervention characteristics, there are a lot of things that can influence how well enrollment to a clinical trial might go. And so a consideration of what is being tested in the trial itself is really important. So for example, if there are few other treatments, then there's going to be a high relative advantage of that trial. So this is basically saying for certain cases like certain advanced metastatic cancers, if there are no other options except a clinical trial, then there's going to be a high pressure to enroll on a clinical trial because you can't get any treatment outside of the trial because it may not exist. There may also be the case where you have lots of existing data for some type of intervention, which corresponds to high evidence strength. This in some cases could be helpful as in a facilitator to enrollment on a trial, because you may say, if this is a later on phase 3 trial for say kidney cancer, and the efficacy of a drug has already been established in melanoma, you may be more likely to enroll on that trial for kidney cancer because you say if it works for melanoma, there's a strong indication it may work as well for kidney cancer. On the flip side, this could potentially hurt you in terms of enrollment, because if there's lots of existing data that it doesn't work, the intervention doesn't work, or if there's lots of existing data for something else that already exists, then there'd be less incentive for you to enroll in a trial. And again, that would be a high evidence strength leading to a low relative advantage of enrolling on a trial. Another piece that's important to consider here, and particularly as a surgeon, I think about this a lot, is this idea of trialability, or can you stop the intervention? There are things like, if you start getting a drug or you start getting a behavior change intervention, it's relatively easy to stop many of those things. You can stop attending, educational courses, things like that. There are other things that you really can't. And so if we're doing a trial of, for example, a drug versus a surgery for prostate cancer, once I take out your prostate, I'm not going to put it back in. That is very hard to reverse. And so it may be harder to enroll patients onto that because you can't reverse it. There's no trialability of that. Now, moving on, sort of a level up from this is the outer setting. And so major questions here include considerations of where your trial is set. And so does a trial reflect local needs is something we got at before of, if there are not a lot of prostate cancer cases in my community, it may not be a great idea to be running a prostate cancer trial there because it doesn't reflect things that my patient population needs. This can correspond to feasibility of the trial itself, as we mentioned, but it can also be things like what's important to my community. If it's not meeting their needs, then they're not going to feel like they should enroll on that. And that can also apply to the community of our providers. So there are certain trials that we are running in urology, for example, where there are things that bother our urologists, and they are very eager to enroll patients onto a trial because they specifically want to know the answer to those questions in order to provide better care for their patients. And if we instead are assessing something that is not important to the urologic community, and specifically our urologic community, then they're going to be less eager to enroll patients to trial. The trial may suffer. So other considerations may be how connected the trial site is specifically to other organizations. So some of our early research has been interviewing clinical trial stakeholders and trying to identify why people are enrolling or not enrolling people onto trials. Something that came up stronger than I had anticipated was where the trial is originating. So if I'm at the University of Michigan and my colleague at the University of Michigan is running a trial, then I'll be potentially more likely to enroll patients onto that trial than if the head is at Ohio State University, for example, just because I'm going to be more loyal and connected to my own site. This can also be a factor, though, where we participate in things like cooperative groups. And so in the United States, we have various cancer clinical trial cooperative groups. If we are participants in that and our organization nationally is encouraging us to enroll onto a trial, we may be more eager to enroll patients onto that trial. So how connected we are makes a big difference. And other components of this can be things like peer pressure. And so again, for surgeons, we tend to be highly competitive. And so if I know that I'm not enrolling as well as other similar surgeons to me, I may feel a strong peer pressure to also participate and also enroll into trials. And this is something we may be able to get at in terms of things like audit and feedback in order to try to key into this peer pressure component to get providers more engaged in trials. Something else that's important here is external policy and incentives that exist for trials. And I bring this up because the importance of context relies a lot on where a trial is set, and where a trial is set is going to hugely impact how it's implemented. So for example, specific to our talk today, health policy is obviously way different in Ireland than it is in the United States. And in other areas relative to the United States in particular, the way care is delivered, the way we are incentivized, the way we're reimbursed can be hugely different. And there are also a lot of things that contribute the way we practice. Even within the United States, the different settings where we have our trials set. We have a pseudo-national healthcare system for our veterans, which is going to be very different from the way we deliver care in an academic setting like the University of Michigan, which is going to be different than our private practice settings, which are going to be community providers. And all that can factor into how the incentives are aligned, why people might be engaging in clinical trials, and sort of tugging in different directions. So that's all going to matter a lot. And there are a lot of geographic considerations too, the outer setting of just the logistics of where you're going to run a trial and what influences you have in terms of how close you are to other places and how far people have to travel. So something considering here, as I brought up at the beginning, this is a to scale map of where we are in Michigan here. With our maize and blue mitten. And then if you put on sort of the green sock, if you will, of Ireland right over the top, it's about the same size as our entire lower peninsula. And so if we're talking about how far patients have to travel in order to access a clinical trial, if we talk about the United States as a whole versus the state of Michigan or the island of Ireland, things like the acceptability of a patient to travel for a trial is going to vary vastly depending on where that's set. And that is a consideration of context. It's going to be very different. And so when I'm talking about things about incentivizing patients or incentivizing people to enroll certain patients onto trials, what we have to do in terms of reimbursing patients for traveling to trials may vary. The idea of being close to a trial may be very different country to country based on just geography. Now, moving on, we're going to burn through a few of these last constructs. There are components of an inner setting that can also factor, not just on a national level, but a culture of research and trials within a single institution can be highly impactful. There may be organizational incentives on top of the culture of participating in trial that can influence why we may be likely to enroll patients onto a trial, why we may be likely to pitch a trial or participate, why we'd be willing to do a trial, all of these. And also how much our organizational leadership can be involved in trials is going to make a big difference. Just having someone at the table to discuss trials and keep pitching them as a champion can be a big difference. There are also, of course, characteristics of individuals, which will make a big difference. I've broken this up into both providers and patients' beliefs about clinical trials. This is saying, you know, people bring up trust a lot in the United States anyway, about talking patients and providers' trust in the clinical trial system. Providers specifically may believe that clinical trials work or they don't. And this is going to influence whether they're going to enroll patients onto it. There are also beliefs about specific trial interventions. So again, within my realm of cancer, surgery versus radiation for prostate cancer is a big question within certain risk groups of prostate cancer. But some patients or some providers, may never enroll a patient onto a randomized trial of radiation versus surgery because their personal convictions are so strong that one or the other option is that much better. So they just may never enroll a patient on such a trial. And then we're going to get into talking about process. sort of seems self-evident, but how much planning for trial implementation occurred can be a huge component of how successful a trial may be. Something else that I think factors into this is things like how well a phase 2 trial was done before you move into a phase 3 trial. How strong is that evidence? How much planning was done? But then also this planning for a specific site can reflect how well a trial itself is going to run, but also how you can work towards ultimately implementing the interventions that are run during the trial period to be sustainable over the long term. Something that can be really influential here, and we're finding in some of our preliminary work here on many of our trials at Michigan, is if you have a strong trial site champion or a strong trial champion, someone who's really advocating for your trial, then that can make a really huge difference in getting uptake of these. If you have someone who's constantly reminding people, you know, hey, this trial exists, so we should be enrolling patients on trials, then you're going to be more likely to have people enroll. There are also things like evaluation measures of audit and feedback. You know, are people seeing how many people are enrolling onto a trial? Is there some type of an emailed audit and feedback that's going on where people are saying, oh, another patient was enrolled? That serves as both a reminder to people that the trial exists and also saying other people are enrolling. Again, that peer pressure, why are you not? So in terms of summary for the determinants we talked about, there are multiple levels of barriers for facilitators to success of clinical trials. For trials, this can range from the intervention level that's being tested in the trial all the way up to international policy, really. And I think one of the big advantages of using a determinant framework is really to organize these factors. And it allows, again, for a toolkit or a checklist so that we can make sure we're not missing things and better structure how we can then move on to the next level of measuring how these works. And the question is we've identified all these barriers for facilitators, but how do we know if it's working? When we try to overcome these barriers, how do we know that we're actually improving implementation? And this is where implementation outcomes come in. In sort of the implementation science world and the implementation science world, implementation outcomes can indicate implementation success. And they can also be proximal indicators of how well implementation processes are working. But they can also be key intermediate outcomes. So they can be sort of a necessary step as you get towards ultimate effectiveness. Some of the implementation outcome frameworks people use are Proctor's outcomes, which are also called the implementation outcomes framework, or RE-AIM, which you may see around. We specifically adapted Proctor's outcomes, which are 8 outcomes meant to measure implementation success, and we adapted these to the clinical trials context. The advantage of using Proctor's outcomes, in my mind, is that they consolidate some terms, and it allows for some granularity in outcomes versus other frameworks. And this is specifically applicable to clinical trials. It's something that I'm very excited about. For example, there are these splits in things like acceptability and appropriateness that we'll talk about in a minute. But I think one of the key areas where I think Proctor's outcomes are really helpful is in measuring trial enrollment outcomes specifically. So how we adapted Proctor's outcomes here is the idea of adoption, which is the proportion of providers who are offering clinical trials to patients, versus penetration, which is the proportion of eligible patients who are being offered a trial. And the reason that's important to distinguish between these is if you have 100 patients who are being enrolled, but they're all from one provider, then the way that you would improve enrollment to that trial is trying to reach out to other providers. But if instead you have 100 patients who are enrolling, but it's one patient each from 100 providers, then maybe we need to be working on penetration in order to reach more eligible patients. So again, if there's a low adoption and high penetration, this means that there are a few engaged providers who are enrolling really well. And so we might consider something like advertising better to other providers to enroll. Whereas if you have high adoption, meaning lots of providers, but few patients being enrolled, then that means we have lots of provider buy-in initially, but few patients enrolled. And so this might be where we consider something like administrative support or some type of a system for trying to identify eligible patients a little bit better. There's some other aspects of outcomes we can measure. Things like acceptability makes a lot of sense. Things like perceived equipoise between the arms and reasonable participant logistics, such as distance to trial sites. So a trial that is very acceptable in terms of logistics, maybe one that I don't have to travel very far for, or there aren't very many follow-up visits, something like that. If you're making a big ask of someone to come in a lot, then they're gonna have to take time off work potentially. and it's going to be a much bigger ask, less acceptable, less likely for patients to enroll. There also has to be a reasonable provider burden. And so it may be that if I have to see patients within a very tight schedule, fitting that into my clinical work is going to be very difficult as opposed to something that's more flexible. There's also this question of appropriateness. Questions have to be amenable to a clinical trial. There are certain studies that just aren't going to work, and the trial design has to be appropriate for the trial question. And again, balancing out these things allows for a lot of nuance in the understanding of things, where there are certain situations where a clinical trial might be the appropriate design, but it's not acceptable. And this is also a way to frame things like the ethics of clinical trials, where, for example, an antibiotic versus a placebo for sepsis would be really great for evidence generation, but would be entirely unethical because we can't knowingly give people things that are non-efficacious. And then there's some trial process outcomes we'll talk about briefly that make a lot of sense and are already used. We ran all of these outcomes by a set of clinical trial stakeholders to make sure that these matched what people's needs were. And feasibility was one of the ones that was already highlighted as something people are considering a lot. And feasibility in terms of clinical trial processes means that it's possible to meet enrollment goals, but also that you can perform all parts of a trial. There are certain things where you have to make sure the drug is available, you have to make sure that procedures can be performed at all sites, things like that. And then there's a consideration of implementation cost, like the cost of trial administration may be prohibitive for certain sites, cost of additional trial staff and materials may be very difficult to build the infrastructure in order to support a trial in certain sites. And this can both make it hard to complete enrollment, but it can also make it hard to find a representative population. And then there's the issue of sustainability, which is an issue of both maintaining enrollment rates after the trial opens, and also whether the intervention can be continued to be provided after the trial concludes. So ultimately, these trial implementation outcomes can help evaluate the success of interventions. I also think that these can serve as good outcomes for studies within a trial. There's this idea coming out of Trial Forge, which is the study within a trial or building in assessments of how we're conducting trials within a trial, which I think is brilliant. And I think that some of these implementation frameworks can be applied for use in studies within a trial. And I think some of these outcomes in particular, really clearly defining these could be used as great trial outcomes for these SWOTs. Trial implementation outcomes themselves can maybe indicate early success or sustainability of trial interventions, and they can also help us in concert with the determinist frameworks to help identify targets for trial improvement. So we sort of did a deep dive, and I want to scale back and take a look at consolidating this approach as we wrap up here, and then we'll leave a little bit of time for answering some questions at the end. The question really is, why do we care about all this? And it really leads us back to developing strategies. All of this is great for sort of the science per se, but ultimately we want to be able to develop strategies that we can test in the real world to try to improve the way that trials are run. So the idea of identifying barriers is really so that we can achieve successful implementation of trials and overcome those barriers with strategies that we're tailoring to our use cases. So for a sample case, let's say I have a prostate cancer clinical trial that's under enrolling. Historically, we may just say, let's hire more recruiting staff to try to improve our recruiting, but is that the right call? And when we go back to our conceptual model for trials here, we just talked about the trial side outcome, linking it back to the causes, our implementation outcomes, our determinant via the CFIR, and then we're going to tack it back to an implementation strategy. So we have this trial that's poorly enrolling. We link it back and say, you know what, we don't have that many clinical trial prostate cancer cases around. This is an issue of trial feasibility, and it's mapped to our outer setting. This is not something I can address within my own facility, and so we're going to add more trial sites. And so again, as we mentioned before, this specifically lets us assess and say, there's a low local disease prevalence, let's address that specifically and add more trial sites. The other advantage of taking this approach is then it leads us down this pathway of saying, okay, we want to add more trial sites. We know local disease prevalence is an issue. How do we select where we're going to place those new trial sites? And so we asked this question and said, what is the role of geography within the United States in prostate cancer clinical trial completion? We merged clinicaltrial.gov data with incidents from statecancerprofiles.gov. And what we tried to do was identify areas that have lots of prostate cancer cases, but had very few clinical trial sites. And this is an example of an intervention that we could potentially use to plan our next trial site. And when we map this out, this is an example of a mouse over map that we have, where actually, when you move your cursor around, it's going to highlight areas that have lots of prostate cancer cases, but few clinical trials. So specifically, again, within the mitten here in Michigan, these red areas are areas where there are lots of cases and few trials. So if I were running a prostate cancer trial within the state of Michigan, I may look to be going to the tip of the mitten in Grand Traverse for my next clinical trial site. So I'm going to wrap up here in the last minute or so with the next steps in trial implementation science, really what we're doing here at the University of Michigan, what I hope to be hearing from some of you about in our sort of next steps in trial implementation science. And a big piece here is I've talked a lot about theory and sort of things in the abstract working, but what we're working on right now is applying these to real trials. So we're trying to apply these adapted frameworks to existing trials within both our institution and within other contexts. We're trying to assess determinants in varied contexts of clinical trials and see how that influences clinical trial enrollment in these different settings. And then we're going to be developing strategies to improve trial enrollment and then trying to rigorously test them in these varied contexts in order to see what works for who and when. And then when we have those things that we think work, then we're going to be using implementation science frameworks to adapt those strategies to work in different contexts as well. Now, this also is possible to approach other problems within clinical trial conduct. Today, we focused on enrollment as a whole, but we can refocus this relatively easily on other gaps. Something specific that comes up a lot in clinical trials is this issue of equity. And representation in clinical trials has been really poor historically. And something we can do using implementation science is shifting this from all enrollment to specifically assessing the context to ensure that interventions engage, include, and are appropriate for everyone. And we can retailer that to say what are the specific barriers that are coming up for specific groups when they're going to be enrolling on trials. And then we can address that specifically and engage those populations directly so we know that the interventions we're designing are appropriate for them. So in summary for now, I took you on kind of a whirlwind tour of our proposition of using clinical trial science to improve clinical trials. And I hope to be discussing this more with you in the future. But in summary, clinical trials, we believe, are evidence-based interventions that are unfortunately currently suffering from poor implementation. We think that applying implementation science to the trial's context can build a platform for trial improvement through both rigorous science, keying into that behavior change and rigorous implementation science literature, as well as establishing more of a shared vocabulary between implementation science and clinical trials methods. We believe that we can use implementation science to better structure approaches to addressing critical context and gaps in clinical trial conduct, such as enrollment and equity. And some of our ongoing work is applying these methods to developing scalable approaches to improving clinical trials. So thank you all for your attention. I'm going to be addressing questions here in a minute, but there's a lot of folks to thank, specifically some of my mentors here at the University of Michigan and other institutions around. We did perform a lot of interviews with clinical trial stakeholders, so want to appreciate them, and then support from the various departments here at the University of Michigan. So thank you all, and now we'll go over some questions, I believe.